Okay, welcome everyone back to the Keep Thriving Wellbeing Conference 2022. I'm Stephen Cook, Head of Policy and Communications at British Safety Council. I'm your chair for today. I am delighted to introduce Oliver Patrick, who is a physiologist and a leading expert in lifestyle management. Hi, Ollie. Ollie runs a corporate wellbeing consultancy service, Future Practice Limited, and founded this wellbeing education platform to deliver coaching skills in areas like sleep, stress, toxicity, and mindset. Ollie was head of physiology at Nuffield Health, where he led the largest team of applied physiologists, wellbeing advisors, and nutritionists in the UK. He's clinically worked alongside each discipline of medicine to drive accelerated health outcomes in his clients. And the title of Ollie's presentation is The Science of Wellbeing. Ollie, over to you.
Great, thanks, Steve, and pleased to be with you all. So the science of well-being. I've got, I think, 30 minutes plus 15 minutes for question and answer. So I think alongside physiologist, I'd call myself a magician if I manage to do this any justice. But I hope, most importantly, you get something out of this that proves useful, either from a mindset piece about how you manage people, but also how you might manage your own science of well-being. What does that mean? If I could go to the next slide, please. Very exciting slide. In fact, if you just bump onto the next one, that'd be brilliant. So, again, Steve covered most of the key things. I think that the context here is I'm a physiologist, so no one really knows what a physiologist is. Even my wife still sort of wonders whether I'm a physiotherapist or a pretend doctor. As a physiologist, I've spent my life really working between the fields of medicine, where I've spent most of my life in medical practices, and fitness. And really, as a physiologist, I've spent my life trying to measure physiology to influence health outcomes. And it's that measurement that I want to talk about today. I'm not coming at today's talk from a research perspective. What is the World Health Organization guidelines on how we lead our lives? I spent a lot of time measuring the physiology, both health and well-being markers of individuals and corporates over the last 23 years. Latterly, delivering the world's most advanced health assessment on a clinic in Harley Street. So I've tried to measure everything you can measure about how the human body works. And I want this to be a sort of contextual session of what have I seen through those measurements? And again, how might that apply to the way you view well-being for yourself and for others? If I could go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. So what's useful? I think, again, most of my life in well-being talks is trying to do a bit of myth busting in terms of what's people's perception of what well-being means. I'll talk a little bit about health versus well-being, how I came to my viewpoint on that. What is the scope of lifestyle? And I believe it's broad, maybe broader than you might expect. What is some of the measurements of physiology that transposes to the way you can, again, influence your lifestyle? And what can we learn from this, again, at an organizational or an individual level? Next slide, please. So when I started in health screening, there'll probably be lots of you who've had a sort of a health MOT, like an annual assessment. I started those back in 1999, and they were very much a doctor-led product with a physiologist at the end running a sort of stress electrocardiogram. And doing that was really interesting because the product was really looking for ill health in people who were fundamentally well. And we had this product which was weighted a bit like this triangle in front of you that said the big focus here is on telling people they don't have some sort of giant tumor, or they're not in the midst of having a heart attack, or they haven't got some sinister pathology. But again, most people don't have those things. So the product was looking for something that was quite low incidence, and it was looking for it with tests that were quite unsensitive. So they weren't particularly brilliant at finding those things in the first place. It also looked at risk factors. So is this body going from being well to being ill? Those might be markers like blood pressure or cholesterol, if we think about the traditional cardiovascular disease, and I'll come to that in a minute. Or it might be changing symptoms. So I used to pee twice a day and now I'm peeing 15 times a day. What does that change mean? But the product didn't have much focus on this concept of feeling. And really interestingly, I was at the end of the health assessment process, or certainly health screen as it was called back then. And you had someone being passed into my office by a very, very good physician who said this person is well. And they were well because they didn't have an obvious cancer. They didn't have an obvious, coronary artery blockage. They didn't have, late stage Alzheimer's. They didn't have a melanoma on their skin. But in that final section with me, they would report fatigue. They'd report maybe a change in libido if we got to that level of trust. They would talk about dodgy skin. They would say, I can't run, because my knees let me down when I run, and I get non-specific back pain most of the time. And these areas that we might describe as feeling were really interesting, because what is the physiology of those? And when we start to look at what we were measuring, were we perhaps measuring the wrong thing? Because actually people weren't that interested in disease, but they were really interested in how their body might work better. And I was interested in how physiology contributed to that process. We can go next slide, please. I think cardiovascular disease, I don't want to turn this into the most horrific talk you've been to, but this chart, if it plays, will be an adapted graph from a European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, talking about the progression of traditional cardiovascular disease. At the moment, it sort of matches my background, so that's totally accidental before you think I'm that organized. I don't know if that will play, but fundamentally, when we look at the progression of cardiovascular disease, and I use cardiovascular disease because it's still the biggest killer on the planet, so it makes it a hot topic. And traditional cardiovascular disease, we're talking about heart attacks, we're talking about strokes, we're talking about heart failure, we're talking about when our body's ability to deliver oxygen through our blood to our body fails in some regard. And what's interesting is again, particularly in the health world, we spend a lot of time measuring whether that problem is at a pretty sinister level. I don't know if you can see the graph, but I can't. Will that play, Steve? It's a jolly exciting graphics. I'd hate to deprive you of it, but we can live without me.
We're working on it, Ollie. Yeah.
Okay, no problem at all. You know, and really what that fantastic graphic that you can't see will show you is that when we think of cardiovascular disease, we spend a lot of time measuring, if you like, at the leaves of the branches. We're looking for an ECG to see whether the arteries are 80–90% blocked. We're looking at cardiovascular risk factors, which says whether those arteries are getting blocked. But we often don't look at the biology or the physiology of why those things occur in the first place. And we go one layer below biology and we say lifestyle. So on that chart, we're going to see that actual behaviors that we adopt in the lifestyle remit. Actually, this is the next graph, but I'll come to this one in a second. You can leave this one on, Steve. It's great. But on that cardiovascular disease, oh, we've gone one further on. Can we go back to? That would be lovely. This is the joys of a live.
Sorry, apologies. So indeed,
no
we're just having the odd technical issue with the internet playing your other video here. But sorry,
don't worry at all. Just bounce to the one next. And oh, there we go. Hooray! And here is the biggest disappointment you'll get today. I built it up, and there it is. Not particularly exciting. So in principle, you know, we look at traditional disease and we say, actually, we spend an awful lot of time looking at that second layer. Could this person have coronary disease? Will they have signs of a vascular dementia? Are they on the verge of a stroke? And we focus our resources there. But what's really interesting is, again, most people don't have those things at a significant clinical level, certainly those attending a screen when they're asymptomatic. But we spend an awful or significantly little period of time measuring that base layer. And if we know that the way I eat, the way I move, physical activity, that if I smoke, and my ability to manage stress, and I'll try and define that in a bit later on, drives the risk factors that drives the dysfunction that drives the disease, then if we're taking a normal population, as in they're not presenting big clinical symptoms because they can directly access medicine, then why are we measuring the wrong thing? Why are we measuring the leaves on the branches rather than the roots of the trees? And really, for me, the physiology of how we look at our behavior interfacing with our physiology before that becomes disease is what I'm absolutely fascinated in. If we go to the next slide, of which you had a delightful sneak preview, you'll see a version of something called the illness wellness continuum. And this was really interesting to me because it helped me frame what medicine is doing, what performance is doing, and what my scope of practice was as a physiologist. And we think of the very British way of defining health. And most people would say, are you well? And an answer to that would say, well, I'm not ill. You know, I'm okay. And our sort of benchmark of are we well is the absence of some chronic disaster going on in our lives. I'm not bad. And again, before this, we sort of looked at the World Health Organization. I think that the definition was on there, but don't worry, which says that, you know, good health is not merely the absence of disease, but a complete state of social, mental, and physiological well-being. That definition is great, but it isn't necessarily deployed through our traditional medical infrastructure. And it can't be, not because medicine isn't brilliant, because medicine is drowning in dysfunctional physiology. So if I think of the illness wellness continuum, it's a way of saying, where am I in terms of my overall health journey? And what's the opportunity of improving my underlying physiology? So if we think of that neutral point in the middle, and that being that average person who isn't ill, but isn't necessarily flourishing, What we've got with medicine, and certainly with health screening, is how early can I find them as they drift to the left towards dysfunction. And if we think of a disease like diabetes, a sign of type 2 diabetes, which is often developed in adulthood, might be a bit more fatigue. A symptom might be that I start urinating more often to get rid of the glucose in my system. And a dysfunction might be I start to lose a little bit of my eyesight because that prolonged glucose starts to affect my ability to see, or my fingertips where it does damage. And a health screen and our medical infrastructure is designed to capture that as early as possible and bring you back to a point where those things are no longer a problem. It doesn't necessarily have a remit, our traditional medical system, to drive you to a performance end of that spectrum. Now, what's interesting about that is we have a pretty strong provision in the marketplace of rehabilitating people from dysfunction to baseline normal. And often the traditional physiologists will be working in cardiovascular or respiratory clinics to take people who've had a heart attack or some kind of pulmonary issue and bring them back to baseline. That's critical. But we don't have a huge provision in that middle space that says, okay, I'm not yet at a significant symptom or dysfunction level, but my body isn't working as well as I might like. And in the world of provision, I think we've got quite a lot at the right of that spectrum in the performance era. So if I go to Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, my beloved Spurs, so we'll see how many people log off. If I go to my beloved Spurs, they'll have, movement coaches, nutritional coaches. They'll have people who are augmenting physiology to a very clear performance remit. But what I'm fascinated in from a well-being perspective is this gray space in the middle. People who aren't at the performance end, people who aren't at the dysfunction end. But if we make their physiology work better, then what would that mean to them? And in that remit of how we feel, the area that people are interested in, the biggest contributor to that will be our lifestyle. If I can go to the next slide, please, Steve. Oh, back at the illness wellness continuum, one more on would be lovely. And so this sort of concept of for me as a physiologist, what's my remit? My remit is to move everyone right. If I meet someone in a clinic who's got a chronic disease, it's to make the impact of that disease less impactful on them. If I meet someone who's not ill but not well, then I've got to listen to what the opportunity of health is to them and what can I change within their behaviors that will change their underlying physiology to bring that benefit to them. And over the years, we've sort of broken lifestyle down into lots of different categories, but my view of lifestyle would really be in these 5 domains. If I can influence these 5 domains on an individual, I will be able to move them right on that continuum against their health goal, not mine. Really important. I don't stand here going, everyone must be optimally functioning. Everyone must be, again, improving their lifestyle. The most important part of any health or well-being initiative is to really understand the reason why. But historically, the benefit of the body working better is more energy, and that might be more energy to overcome the chemotherapy that someone's undergoing. That might be more energy to be able to complete a performance task like run a 5K. But if energy sits at the core of what we're trying to do with lifestyle, these are the domains: and movement, nourishment, recovery, mindset, and environment. I want to touch on a little bit of each of them today. What is the physiology of those, and what are the key things that we maybe misunderstand and I could share that might be useful today? If we go next slide, please, that'd be great. So well-being is pretty much the sum of our actions, and again, I talk a little bit about DNA later. When I was fortunate enough to start measuring DNA back in the sort of early 2000s, we thought it would unlock our health. We'd find the gene for cancer, we'd find the gene for obesity, we'd find the gene for X, Y, and Z. And we've seen that, yes, while genes do contribute to certain conditions, their contribution is diminishing, a diminishing force. And we're seeing now that well-being, as I would look at it, is really that every day all of you will engage in activities that nurture your physiology. And every day, all of you will engage in activities that impact negatively on your physiology. And if your state of current health is not where you want it to be, then altering the balance on those scales is absolutely critical. There is no singular activity that is universally bad or good. The question is, what is the sum of those collective activities through those 5 domains? And if you want to change something, how do you adjust those scales in a way that positively impacts you or your people? And we'll start that with movement, which is, for me, one of the most talked about but also misunderstood areas of physiology and well-being. If we could go next slide, please, Steve. Movement, what on earth does it mean? And again, movement, if we go straight into the next slide, just because no one's that thrilled with my squiggly line. Here's an interesting one. So when I think about movement, movement, much like lots of things in the well-being world, has been miscommunicated. It's been hijacked. So when you think about movement and activity and exercise, and they're different animals, historically people would associate that with body composition or weight. So you look fit because your weight is perfectly under control. We're clearly understanding that our nutritional activity is probably a bigger determination of our weight and body composition than how active we are. But again, the body requires all 5 domains to be in some degree of balance, so movement's critical. Why do I move? Why do I encourage movement? Not to burn calories. It's a pretty poor way of burning calories. And equally, when I've done more movement, I get hungrier. So I'm going to possibly compensate for that unless I'm very disciplined. So what do I think about movement? Well, when I think about movement, I start with the very basis of human functionality, which is energy production. For those biologists in the audience, you'll remember that horrible lesson when you went into the anatomy of the cell in the body. So our body made up of trillions of cells. In the cells that generate energy, we have a little battery called a mitochondria. It's always called the battery of the human cell. And it basically makes energy. It makes something called ATP that's like a Christmas cracker. And every time your body wants to combust energy, it snaps that cracker and then it tries to glue those crackers back together again. That's what mitochondria does. It generates the unit of energy that allows me to think now, that keeps my body running. It's the basic unit of human combustibility. Why is that interesting? Well, movement, and particularly aerobic activity, so activities that overload my body's ability to circulate blood to my systems, increases the density of mitochondria in my cells. That's extraordinary, right? So I can increase my batteries in the human body by how much I move. What is one of the main physiological changes between me now and me at my dad's age, turning 80 later this year? Well, there's many things, and I'll talk about a few of them, but one of them is the integrity and volume of mitochondria. So why do I age? Why am I less able to do things as I age than I was when I was a younger man? Yes, hormones, yes, muscle mass, but certainly mitochondrial density. And that mitochondrial quality is the reason why I want people to be active. Now, energy isn't about, are you, a sort of hyperactive, and I'm talking quite fast today because that 30 minutes is ticking. Are you a high energy person? That's not necessarily the expression of energy. We're seeing certainly a caffeine problem with people because we're generally seeing a shortfall in ability to wake up and feel energized. But that energy will translate into cognition. What's my clarity of thought? That energy will translate into immunity. For me, the biggest, again, biological marker of energy is if I get something wrong with me, then my energy goes to my immune system, and that means I lay in bed for a couple of days. So I've got a resource of energy. When I had COVID just before Christmas, I didn't lose energy. I redistributed the energy I had available to my immune system, and that meant I had a bit of a brain fog and I couldn't get out of bed for 2 days. That's how clever the body is. So the benefit of more energy ties into my body's ability to withstand certain viruses that come along, be that COVID, be it other, my ability to recover from some kind of traumatic event. So movement isn't about, can we get people active because we want them to burn calories, because we want them to fundamentally control their weight. Movement is the unit of human energy. And if an individual has a reason for more energy, then looking at how we combust more energy to generate more energy is amazing. There's a phrase that the human machine is the only machine that winds its own springs. And that is true when working, again, in really complex energy situations like chronic fatigue syndromes, ME, post-viral fatigues. We know one of the key modalities, albeit controversial, is increasing movement, because movement generates energy. It doesn't cost it. We can go to next slide, please. That'd be great. So movement is slightly separate to exercise because the human body was designed to move. If someone is unable to walk, then how can we generate movement in that environment? I'm really keen that we understand special populations. Having a chronic pain disorder or having a musculoskeletal disorder is a massive barrier, but we need to find ways to overcome that because movement is very much the lifeblood of what the human machine wants. But that's different to exercise, which exercise again has become a sea of misinformation. I would potentially see someone years ago who'd say, Ollie, I exercise with a weight training session on the Monday, then I do Pilates on the Wednesday, and I go for a run at the weekend. So I train 3 times a week. And I'd say, it's interesting. You probably train once per week. You're training 3 different biological systems. And what do I mean by training? Exercise is damage. I'm giving a system of biology in my body something it can't do. That's why exercise hurts a little bit. Not massive, hurts a little bit. Because I'm taking a system of biology. Let's call one system cardiovascular capability, my ability to deliver oxygen. Let's call another one strength or muscle mass, my ability to generate force. And let's call another one my mobility, my ability to move in harmony and certainly pain-free as pain-free as possible. Those 3 biological systems are integral to how my body works as I sit here now. If I decide one of those biological systems would benefit from being improved, then I overload it. If I overload it, the body is damaged. Let's imagine I overload my cardiovascular system by going for a run. My body says, ouch, Ollie, what are you doing? And that run creates so much damage that my body spends the next 24 to 48 hours rebuilding its capability so it doesn't get hurt as much when I do it again. And that progressive overload over time is how we adapt. Now, again, forget the concept of body composition and we exercise for weight management. These things have been mispurposed by the fitness industry largely, not through any design or default, but because it knows its target audience. But when I talk about exercise, I'm not talking to gym goers, I'm talking to humans who want to understand, if I want the benefit of more cardiovascular capacity, I need to overload that. If I want the benefit of more strength, I need to overload that system, and that probably does take place best in a gym, which is disappointing but true. And if I want, again, better quality of movement, reduced incidence of pain on movement, then I need to overload my movement quality. And we've seen the rise of Pilates, yoga, mobility, certainly to offset the sedentary lifestyle of the average sitting person. So exercise isn't one thing that everyone has to do. You have to take a step back and say, what is the particular biological system I'm keen to overload? And different systems have different benefits for the individual. So if someone has got dysfunctional immunity, or someone has got, again, a problem with energy, then overloading that cardiovascular system through what we call aerobic exercise becomes priority. If someone is aging, which I am aggressively, then as I move from my 40s into my 50s, into my 60s, one of the biggest challenges to me is this phrase sarcopenia, which is the age-related loss of muscle mass. My body will try and lose 3 to 5% of its muscle tissue every decade, and that will impact my bone density and my likelihood of breaks. But that will also affect my ability to mop up sugar in my blood. It will also affect my ability to build testosterone, which gives me my vivacity, or part of it. So again, depending on where I am in stage of life, I might actually need weight training more than I need cardiovascular exercise. And if I can't exercise, then I might need the gateway in terms of increased mobility to get me there. Again, I can't solve or reach through the screen and find out individual status quo, but I think we need to take a step back from lifestyle and say we're being told we need to do these things, but we're not always being told why. So what is the biological system I think I'd benefit from having enhanced, and what then is the most strategic way to increase that? If I could go to the next slide, please. Nourishment, again, goodness me, a war has broken out in nutrition, and the fact that, in many cases we have a sort of polarized view of what a good diet looks like at the moment. If we go to next slide, please. So I want to just take a step back and say, let's look at what I've seen, again, over the last 23 years, which are 3 areas that people have forgotten about in the purpose of food. And certainly, when most people talk about nutrition, they again fall into the calorie trap, that we're talking about energy density of our food and our predisposition to gain or control our weight. So let's take a step back and say, well, of course, food's first role is to provide me things that my body doesn't make itself. I don't make vitamin C, I don't make vitamin D. If I don't eat them, then my body won't be able to do the biological functions that they perform. My body needs certain proteins, my body needs certain fats, my body needs, again, certain minerals and vitamins. Otherwise, it doesn't work very well. And what we would first look at with diet is it nourishing? Is it providing the nutrients that my body requires? And again, this little picture on the right is an example of a test that I've run for many, many years when I was in a clinic on Harley Street, to look at whether an individual's nutrients have been sufficient for their biological need. And in almost all cases, they are not. Why are they not? Because the good diet on the left-hand side is non-processed, so it hasn't been largely refined to remove all those key vitamins and minerals. It's diverse. Again, we're seeing the need to eat multiple different food groups as a critical way of providing different nutrients, but also different fibers. And I could eat Thai food 3 meals a day for the rest of my life. We've seen the return of diseases of malnourishment because people are eating such a narrow diet rather than they're unable to access nutrition. So is that diet, again, plant-based or veg-centric? We don't have to be vegan, and there's, again, very, very different schools of thought in terms of environmental benefits to certain diets. But again, if I'm looking at historically, what have I seen as the misunderstanding of diets is that we've forgotten it's about nourishment. We've forgotten it's about lots of different types of nutrients available from different foods, of different colors, of different species. We've forgotten that plants contain huge amounts of beneficial nutrients that we won't get necessarily compensated for with a smoothie. And equally, as we over process and cook our food, we reduce the nutrient capability. I put supplements on there because people always ask, should I take a supplement? I'm not a clinical nutritionist, and I don't advise on supplements outside of personalized data, but I would say I've rarely seen someone well nourished without some buffering supplements in the key areas I've already mentioned today. I can go to the next slide, please. Again, when we're looking at how do I impact on physiology, clearly I need to nourish my physiology, because without that, we fall over. You'll notice that if you follow a plant-centric, diverse, lightly cooked diet, there'll be a calorie benefit as well, but we'll come back to that later. One of the great challenges of nutritional science is there's a war that's broken out between the reason people are generally getting overweight and the way diet is contributing to particularly cardiovascular disease, where there's a group who are very much in the sort of key literature which says calories is the key reason people gain weight, and that's the key reason that we're developing increased risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And then there's a carbohydrate insulin model of obesity that says actually we're eating too much carbohydrate that's been refined. That causes too much of a hormone called insulin to be produced, and that's driving weight gain and inflammation, which is an unwanted reaction at a chronic level in populations. I won't get into that debate, other than the fact that in most cases what you see is the key issue with people's diet is that it is overprocessed, and the carbohydrate they're eating is too close to sugar for the body to really benefit from that. This is a result from a continuous glucose monitor, which if anyone here has got type 1 or type 2 diabetes, they may be familiar with. You put a little sticker on the back of your arm, brilliant technology, and it allows you to measure the level of sugar in your blood over days and weeks. And that's great if you are responsible for injecting insulin to control that. But that data is also now moved into the sort of biohacker collective who are interested in the role of stable blood sugar in optimizing particularly cognitive function. So my brain runs predominantly on glucose, so it's the first organ to detect if my sugar is too low, and it's certainly the organ that will benefit from stable blood sugars compared to lots of the other parts of the body. Why am I showing you this? Well, again, this is a continuous glucose monitor from someone who didn't particularly eat plant-based foods, who didn't eat foods that were, again, low in refined carbohydrate, white bread sandwiches, pasta, excessive donuts, junk food. And of course, in most people, I think in the UK diet, about 50% of our diet now is processed food. And lots of that food is hyperpalatable processed food, which means I eat it and I get no biological feedback mechanism that says you are full. So I overconsume compared to if I eat fiber or protein-rich foods, which give a greater feedback mechanism. So again, on feeding on to point number one, point number two is in plant-based or diverse and lightly cooked raw food, we actually, if we eat those foods, we see a much stable blood glucose level, which would give me more energy, plus theoretically reduce my likelihood of disease. I use that word theoretically crucially. We'll go to the next slide, please. That'd be great. If you haven't heard about gut health in the last, again, year, 2 years, then you've probably not been on the TV or internet. Again, well-being comes very quickly to a product marketplace, not a service marketplace. What do I mean by that? Most of you will have been sold fermented foods, probiotics, prebiotics, because the marketplace has grown to tell you those things are the panacea of being well. The gut, which predominantly means the large intestine, but could mean anything down from my whole digestive process, mouth to bum, is really integral to how we work, and we're growing in our understanding of how that works. I'll touch briefly on the fact that this microbiome, our beneficial bacteria picture, is critical to that. And when we see diets that are, again, high in processed foods, low in fiber, low in plant-based, we often see deficient volumes of the beneficial bacteria that drive a huge part of our immune system. We know most of our serotonin, which is a key part of our happiness, is manufactured in the gut, but our gut is also really the engine room for our immunity. So if my body eats the right type of fibers, as in that diverse plant-based food, it feeds the bacteria in my large intestine. That generates elements that control and influence my immune system. Early science. Do we go to prebiotics? Do we go to probiotics? Prebiotics are fibers that feed bacteria. Probiotics are delivering live bacteria down to my colon. We take a pause and we say, look, is my diet fibrous enough? Again, if I did a nutritional analysis on the likely population, I'll probably find deficiencies in 3 key areas: good fats, volume of protein, and volume of fiber. So if you did something like a MyFitnessPal and you tracked your diet over those 3 days, historically, unless you are really deliberately focusing on your diet quality, those are the natural pitfalls. And a diet that has a little bit more fiber, has a little bit more, again, quality protein, and has some good fats, and I can't cover what food groups those are in this talk, then you will find you're supporting your underlying physiology better. What does that mean? If I've got someone who's dysfunctional and wants to be less dysfunctional, it brings them forwards. If it's someone looking for performance, it moves them in that direction. Again, these are the actions and behaviors that move your physiology right, because they're what your physiology wants. Forget the name well-being above the door. These are the actions that augment beneficial physiology. If we can go to next slide, please. Conscious flying through the time. I hope you're still with me. So recovery, again, it sort of boomed as a product marketplace again. If we go to next slide, please. What does it even mean? Recovery for me would be activities that do several things. Either increase my body's ability to restore energy. That's point number one. Increase my body's ability to go into correct and appropriate sleep cycles. That's point number two. And activities that turn off unnecessary inflammatory processes. It's a slightly technical concept, all three of those, but I'm going to try and dive into them in a bit of detail. What on earth is on the screen here? Now, again, really the interesting thing for me over the last 23 years is seeing how the physiology of recovery impacts on everything. What do I mean? Everyone on this call as we speak is having their internal physiology governed by something called the autonomic nervous system. I control my motor nervous system, a little bit dancey, but I don't control my digestive secretions, my temperature, my blood pressure, my heart rate. All of those things are being governed automatically by one nervous system that likes to accelerate those biological processes and one nervous system that likes to decelerate those biological processes. And in effect, the human body is a battery. It expends energy and it recoups energy. In seeing that, we can break that into layman's terms. You might have heard of fight or flight, or the fight or flight nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system. And you might have heard of the rest and digest nervous system, the parasympathetic. With some clever technology pioneered in the early 70s, we can look at heart rate, but not the rate itself, the variability of the heart rate, and quantify how long someone is spending with their internal physiology ready for some kind of threat, and how long they're spending ready to recoup energy. We go to next slide, please. And one of the technologies I've used over the years to do this, and there's many. In fact, I've got one on me now, a Whoop band, which is, some people think it's a sleep monitor. This is a heart rate variability analytic that is trying to quantify over 24-hour cycles how long my physiology is spending in the alert state and how long my physiology is spending in the recuperative state. This is a better visual example from a technology called Firstbeat, born out of Finland. Very clever. And on that graph along the bottom, effectively, we can quantify how often someone's body is ready for stress and how often someone's body is ready to recoup energy. And that will include the processes that go on during sleep. I bring this quick example because historically, if I measure this on your average individual, we see a very common trait, which is an absence of sufficient 24-hour recovery. It used to be thought, certainly when I started in clinical practice, that the executive was hyper stressed. Now, in many cases, we've got to look at stress, and it's a bigger definition than I can cover here. What I would say the physiological trait is of the busy person is not excessive stress, but inadequate recovery. Inadequate periods of time where their body goes into physiological recovery and they get the restorative benefits from that. And that's, again, why we're seeing huge rise in meditation apps, breathing focused activities. If anyone follows Wim Hof, ice baths are a double whammy to increase my body's ability to go into that green physiology you see on that map, which is where I go into recovery. This individual had no recovery during the day and actually didn't go into any recovery up until about 4 a.m. at night. And the lives we lead are telling our internal physiology, you've got to be switched on, got to be ready. And if I add to that caffeine, which is a biological stimulant, and then I try and suppress that with alcohol, which is one of the greatest marketing mismanaged tricks of all time. Alcohol is a muscle relaxant, which gives me the impression of going into recovery, but neurologically, it's a stimulant that suppresses my sleep cycle. If we go to the next slide, please, that'd be great. So what is the benefit here? Well, again, if I'm trying to move someone's physiology right, where are the actions and behaviors that are going to drive their body into restorative physiology? And certainly if I can't do that during the day, how do I get quality sleep? Here's a very basic view of a sleep cycle, which most of you, again, if you've ever measured with a basic monitor, will see there's REM sleep and non-REM sleep. Haven't got time to go into all of that today. But what's relevant is we get, again, biological benefits from different stages of sleep. But you'll see on that chart, stage 4 or stage 3 and 4 sleep is called deep sleep. And it's where a huge amount of our cellular repair takes place. Huge amount of our body's immune system takes place. All the benefits that we really want from a memory consolidation perspective. Huge amounts of benefits that you don't get in other stages of sleep. Why is that relevant? Well, it normally happens in the early part of the night. And that early part of the night, a bit like that last graph, is the most impacted by poor sleep hygiene, as in the disciplines to drive recovery in the last 90 minutes before bed, poor ability to drop my core temperature, which is integral to going into deep sleep. So I can't be exercising high intensity work too late in the evening. I can't be, again, doing activities that stimulate me just before I try and destimulate my whole physiology. But certainly here, the pressing news is the mismanagement of alcohol as a muscle relaxant slash theoretical sedative, but actually a neurological stimulant. So when I'm looking at moving anyone's physiology right, how we transition them into sleep, particularly to access deep sleep, is absolutely fundamental to that. You know, dry January was fascinating. All over my Instagram was people going, I feel amazing. You know, I can't believe I've detoxified so much from not drinking any alcohol for a month. Yes, the liver likes a break. It likes a break within the week, not just within the year. But fundamentally, those people are reporting better sleep cycles, the energy restoration that happens during quality sleep, and they can't believe how great they feel. I think most of them are back on the booze for February. But c'est la vie. Alcohol's not a no-go, it's about strategic use. If I want better energy the following day, then alcohol suppresses my chance of accessing that. If I wake up with fatigue, we've got to remember that's a biological feedback mechanism that says I haven't restored sufficient energy. And if I then medicate that with caffeine, it's like looking at the leaves of the branches. That's treating fatigue as something that I've got to mismanage. It's a message you're not getting your energy restoration balance right, and we need to find ways of driving that parasympathetic energy restoration system in the day. Go next slide, please. I want to leave some time for a question or two, but again, our physiology doesn't stand alone. If we go next slide as well, please, thank you. Then we fundamentally interface with our environment, and again, there's lots of things I could talk about with the role of our environment on our physiology, either moving left in a problematic fashion or moving right. I could talk about toxicity ingested through water, through foods, through pesticides, and a whole broad of things. But for the sake of a snapshot, our interface with light and dark is a really relevant part of how we control our biology. My 24-hour biology, my circadian rhythm, is influenced by the buildup of fatigue in my body, which is one, but also a little part of my brain that's watching for when is it light, I must be awake, and when is it getting dark, I must be asleep. And the mismanagement of devices that generate blue light, that trick our brain into a confused rhythm, is a huge part of where we see sleep onset delayed, and certainly deep sleep dysregulated. We're seeing again a rise in understanding we need to access natural light within the first hour of waking up, and we need more red light, more dim light as we move into the cycles in the evening. If we're watching Netflix in bed, or we're even worse, picking up emails, then we can't look at that first morning fatigue and say there's not some contributory factor to that. If I wake up feeling amazing, my energy is great, and I feel great, these things don't matter, right? So crucially, this isn't about everyone must do everything. It's about where am I in my individual journey? What's the benefit of moving right? And could my environment play a part in that? We go next slide, please. I'll talk about mindset. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but I work with them and I think they're fantastic, and all different types of psychological professional. If we bounce to one further slide, and I think with mental health, which is probably most people's understanding of psychological health, we've got a bit of a culture of looking, a bit like I was talking about at the beginning with heart attacks, with most people's definition of mental health being, is there an anxiety, is there a depression? We're looking at, can we capture people who are at the dysfunctional level and bring them back to baseline? And I'm really interested in psychological fitness, which says we all have mental health on a fluctuating basis. Yes, we need very clever ability to triage and capture people who are diminishing in that capability and moving to a chronic problem. But what are the actions, behaviors, and tools that determines I have more good mood days than poor mood days? I'm not at a clinical level. Again, in the same way as I look at lifestyle, yet there's lots of activity in the sports performance psychology remit at the top. There's lots of activity in bringing people who are experiencing chronic poor mental health, but everybody has mental health on a fluctuating basis. And where are the factors that influence that, and am I aware of them? If I've got a particularly low mood state today, what are my nutritional actions, what are my societal actions, what are my behavioral actions that might help lift me out of it, rather than waiting for, again, in my cholesterol case, a statin, and in my mental health case, waiting for a treatment program. Got to be careful there, because we've really, lots of people with a real chronic mental health need urgent and quality ongoing support. But for those people in the middle, can we think about what are the tools that drive increased psychological well-being? And again, too big for this talk today. We skim to the last two slides, please, Steve. That'd be great. Oh, one more here. I talked a bit about genes, and again, why am I increasingly passionate as a lifestyle professional? Because we're seeing the contribution of our DNA to traditional diseases dropping. I use some of the stats there in the table from the Alzheimer's gene that, again, is quite a strong gene contribution to disease, that if you have two copies, so one from your mum, one from your dad, of a particularly bad gene, then you have a 70% likelihood of developing Alzheimer's at the age of 85. Why is that relevant? Because even on a really strong gene effect, there's still 30% of people who don't get it. So what are the 30% doing versus the 70%? This isn't to put blame at people when they develop a disease. It's to say, look, if I've got dodgy genes, my parents give me some dodgy genes, I've got to work a little harder than the person who's got, again, genes where everyone in their family lived to be 115 despite smoking and living a hedonistic, probably quite enjoyable life. So fundamentally, the gene contribution is diminishing, which means the power needs to sit in the lifestyle. So lifestyle sits at the root to health. Movement is essential, and exercise should be strategic. Likely nutritional errors are fiber, food diversity, insufficient protein. And the human battery needs recharging. Seek activities that drive what we call parasympathetic tone and drive us into energy restoration. Morning light in the evening, dim light in the evening. Sleep hygiene is great. And then one final slide. Of course, Steve throws me off, rightly so. What, and again, if I'm thinking out the organizational layer, what does the organization of the future look like? And many of these are obviously happening in the present, but it supports the lifestyle of its employees. And again, resource-wise, I think that's a really interesting debate. If I've got a finite resource and I'm spending a lot of time on screening for diseases that aren't there with tests that are relatively insensitive versus driving an improvement in underlying physiology that has a performance and a disease prevention perspective. When we see good corporate wellbeing schemes, we see a wellbeing culture, which is the leadership leads. It's a see one, do one. If well-being is deployed as something for the people below, it doesn't work. It's always been the case that the actions and behaviors of the leaders will set the tone for effective or ineffective. We need, again, a well-being environment. Some of these things are passive. What's the water quality? What's the access to vegetables? What's the access to food and beverage? What's the access to all the things that mean it's the path of least resistance in my organization to make positive behaviors rather than the path of least resistance to make negative impacts on physiology. It's got to be your individual reason why. You can't be this idea of well-being. It just doesn't work. So how do we find that through education to get people to the point? And how do we make this as easy as possible to move from an action to a habit? And again, is that a gym? Is that an in-house food and beverage? Is that sleep pods? Lots of discussions in that area. Steve, I shall bow out there because I don't want to run over, but covered a lot.
That's great. And Ollie, first of all, just to say thank you very much. Secondly, that there's been some really positive comments about this session. So we could probably go on all day on this, to be honest. And there are quite a few questions, and we really don't have, well, we're out of time, but we are going to run on slightly into what was our break. Obviously, we're a wellbeing conference, so breaks are important. But just for the sake of answering a few of these, that's okay. Yeah. Some quite factual ones to start with, really quick answers, I guess. First of all, what's your, you mentioned probiotics. Someone just wants to clarify, what's your recommendation on probiotics? Sorry, just for sense of clarity.
Yeah, I think a probiotic is probably, you couldn't say everyone needs it. I think the easy step there is the addition of fermented foods, so foods that have live bacteria in them. You get an increased diversity of bacteria and they can work extremely well. So the addition of kimchi, sauerkraut, kombucha, these foods, they generally all begin with K. But if you look at fermented foods, and 1 to 2 portions a week is a really good start to say some of that bacteria should reach where it's required.
Someone wants to know, actually, is bacon and other similar packaged meats from supermarkets deemed as processed? It's quite an interesting question, that. But
it's a great question, and yes, it would be, but processed in a different way. So generally, the processing of carbohydrate is what we're worried about in terms of it starts as a grain with a sort of different layers of fiber on it, and then you remove all that fiber. And in the removal of that fiber, you change, normally I would break that fiber down by chewing it, and then my small intestine, my stomach, small intestine, large intestine, it's sort of like pre-digested food. So that processing of meats is a slightly different issue, and the query over what impact they have on some of the mechanisms that contribute to cancer. And it's sketchy, but particularly bowel cancer is the potential risk to processed meats. I think when we're generally talking about processed foods, it's carbohydrate rich foods that have been turned from fibrous and chewy to less chewy, thus more palatable, but less effective.
Okay, thank you. Very good. What's your view on intermittent fasting? We can't talk much on this, obviously, but in a very quick sort of, however long you can tell us, do you think intermittent fasting is a good idea?
Yeah, I think there's great legs in it. The key, intermittent fasting is having long periods of the day, so where you don't eat. So we reduce our period of meal time. So the most common one would be 16/8, where I go 16 hours without eating anything. I eat all my meals in an 8-hour window. The data in terms of longevity and will my cells that might have turned into a cancer cell kill themselves, this autophagy, are generally out of rat studies. There's not brilliant human longevity studies. I think it's a very effective way of controlling total calories. It's likely a very effective way of increasing your sensitivity to insulin, albeit that's debatable. But again, if you have a disorganized relationship with food, then it might not be beneficial in that regard. So I think we've just got to play, again, the context card. I do 16/8 during the week because I can reference that as an effective way of managing my energy. I think the logic of longevity is solid to me, albeit the evidence isn't there. But it's ultimately a very quick and effective way to manage your calories, as long as you have the capability to do that in a way that doesn't trigger an eating disorder.
Well, we're going to have to stop there. We've got 5 minutes for our break coming up. We're going to thank you very much again. A great session, really, really useful. Lots packed in. And someone actually wants to know, do you have a book?
I don't have a book, but you
Maybe,
never know. You never know.
You never know.
Yeah,
And if you are if you're interested in the slides from these sessions, I guess as well as sending out recordings, we will also be able to ask you guys, the presenters, if you're willing for us to share your slides as well.
Very, very happy.
You're happy with that, so we can probably do that as well. Okay, great. Well, look, we're going to have our 5-minute break now, so why not make a cup of tea or coffee, just stretch your legs, obviously, following that session is probably a good idea.
Definitely.
And we look forward to welcoming you back for next session, the third one about an award-winning wellbeing initiative. So look forward to seeing you there at 11:40. And to join that session, please do go to the event homepage and click on the next session when it goes blue. Thank you.